The morning in Wyoming broke thin and sharp. A sheet of cold light stretched over the sagebrush, painting the frost-whitened grass in shades of violet and gray. Thomas saw the rope first. It was raw hemp cutting a hard, ugly line across his fence post, a thing that didn't belong. Then he saw the small shape slumped beneath it. He swung down from his horse, his boots whispering in the frozen grass. As he got closer, the shape resolved into a girl, 16, maybe. Her dark hair was matted with ice, her lips split and cracked from a thirst that must have lasted all night. Angry red rope burns ringed her wrists. It was as if the darkness itself had tried to hold her down and failed. He didn't reach for her, not right away. 20 years alone on this land had taught him a hard lesson. Sudden kindness can scare a wild thing worse than cruelty. He kept his distance, letting her see him, letting her know he wasn't a threat. He slid a worn knife from his belt. The blade was sharp, honed by years of practical work. He moved slowly, deliberately, and slipped it under the knot that held the rope to the post. He pressed just a little, and the fibers sighed apart. The rope fell away. Her eyelids fluttered, just a twitch, and then fear opened them the rest of the way. "Don't," she rasped, her voice a dry crackle. She scrambled backward, a panicked crab walk, until her heels bumped hard against the wooden fence. "I won't touch you," Thomas said. He kept his voice low, low enough not to break the fragile morning quiet. He held his palms out, open and empty, showing her he had no weapon, no ill intent. The wind tugged at the collar of his coat. It carried no other sound but the distant cry of a coyote and the soft creak of the settling fence posts. "You're on my land," he said. "That's all you need to know for now." She searched his face, her eyes wide and terrified, looking for a map to safety but finding only blank spaces. He was a big man. The weather and the work had squared him off, where gentler years might have made another man soft and round. But his gray eyes were steady. They weren't hungry. They weren't cruel. They were just there. Her gaze dropped to the cut rope lying in the frost at her feet. Then it climbed back up, past his worn boots, past his calloused hands, held open and empty, and finally met his eyes again. "What's your name?" he asked, the words soft. "Clara," she whispered. She said it like she was confessing to a terrible crime. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, as if the name explained everything he needed to know. "There's water at the cabin," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the low rise beyond the cottonwood trees. "You can walk beside me. No one lays a hand on you here, not unless you ask." She didn't move. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, fogging in the cold air and then breaking apart. He could feel the terror rolling off her in waves. He measured the distance in his mind. The distance to the canteen on his saddle, the distance to the cabin door, the distance a frightened child could run before collapsing. "All right," he said, speaking almost to the frost itself. "We'll start with this. You only answer what you can." Her eyes slipped past him, down to the dirt. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the track scars in the ground, two fresh grooves where wagon wheels had cut a path skirting his fence line before fading into the wide, empty distance. She swallowed, a painful, dry sound. "My stepfather," she said at last, the words torn from her. "He brought me. In the night." Thomas let the words hang in the cold air between them until they stopped shaking. He didn't ask the questions burning in his mind. He just waited. "Why here?" he finally asked, his voice still quiet. She blinked hard, as if fighting back tears or a memory. "Wolves need feeding," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Same as folks. And men. Men don't ask questions about what's already been taken." A hot, dark anger rose in Thomas. It was like heat building under a thick sheet of ice. He kept it buried. Anger wouldn't help her stand. Anger wouldn't make her safe. "I can take you to town," he said carefully, measuring each word. The sheriff will make a record of it." Clara's head snapped up, a quick, hopeless shake of no. The movement was practiced, automatic, the gesture of someone who had said no 1,000 times and never been heard. "He'll send me back," she said, her voice flat with certainty. "He always sends me back." Thomas looked toward the wagon tracks that scarred the road, and he saw what she feared. It wasn't a road to safety. It was a circle, a trap that would close the moment she reached it. He thought about the town sheriff, a man who called family matters private business, a man who believed a closed door was a border he shouldn't cross. He thought about how the raw hemp rope had bitten into her wrist, right where a wedding bracelet might have been. "Then town is the wrong direction," he said. "Cabin first." He stepped away from her then, turning his back, giving her a choice. It was a risk. She could run, but he knew somehow that she wouldn't. After a long, silent moment, he heard the soft scuff of her worn shoes in the frost. She was coming alongside him, not behind him, beside him. They walked without speaking. The sun climbed a little higher, but the cold held on, biting at their faces. At the porch of his small, sturdy cabin, he opened the door and stood aside, letting her enter first. "Drink slow," he said, setting a tin cup by the wash basin. "And if you want to leave after, I'll saddle your choice of horse and point you wherever you ask to go." Clara's small fingers wrapped around the cup. The cold metal seemed to steady her. She lifted it to her lips, and the water hit her tongue. She flinched as if its simple honesty was a shock. When she looked up at him, her voice was a little stronger. "Thank you," she said. "For now," Thomas answered, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the vast, empty horizon. "For now is how we'll start." But the horizon wasn't empty anymore. Through the kitchen window, Thomas caught the movement first. It was a long, thin smear of dust, unfurling against the pale blue sky. 3 riders, and they were closing fast. He'd lived on this land long enough to recognize the brutal urgency in their pace. Men only rode like that with a purpose, and that purpose was rarely good news. His hand tightened on the rough wood of the window frame. Time, he realized, was shorter than he'd hoped. A lot shorter. Behind him, the silence in the cabin was broken only by the tremble of the tin cup against the wooden table. Clara sat rigid, clutching the cup he'd given her. Water sloshed over the rim, rattling against her teeth as she tried to drink. Each swallow looked like a monumental effort. Her eyes kept jerking toward the door, as though she expected it to burst open at any second. She wasn't just frightened. She was waiting for the inevitable. "Easy," Thomas said quietly, his voice a low rumble. But she barely seemed to hear him. Her knuckles were bone white where she gripped the cup. Her shoulders were drawn in tight, as if she were bracing for a blow. He recognized that posture. He'd worn it himself once, years ago, before he'd escaped the house that had taught him the value of silence and the cost of speaking up. The hoofbeats were still a distant thunder, but Clara's fear was already in the room, thick and suffocating. When she finally spoke, her voice was a thin, frayed thread of sound. "They're coming back for me." Thomas turned from the window, his gray eyes narrowing. "Those men out there." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling water in her cup, as though she was afraid to meet his eyes. "My stepfather," she began, her voice cracking. "He told me I was payment for his debts, that someone would come and take me." Her words faltered, then steadied with a bitter, chilling clarity. "But he changed his mind. He said I wasn't worth enough. He said I'd bring shame on him. So he left me here." Her hands shook harder, and droplets of water spilled onto the rough-hewn table. "He said the wolves would clean up his mistake." The words hit Thomas with the force of a branding iron he thought had long gone cold. Wolves. Mistakes. Debts measured in human flesh. He had heard those sentences before, spoken in different voices, in a different place, a lifetime ago. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek, but his reply was calm, steady as a rock. "Not while you're on my land," he said, turning back to the window, where the dust cloud grew larger, darker, more ominous. "Not while I'm standing." But as he watched them, he saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. One of the riders wasn't alone. They were dragging something behind their horse, a dark, lumpy shape kicking up its own trail of dust. It wasn't a sack. It wasn't supplies. It was a man, and he was struggling. Thomas stood in the middle of his cabin, shoulders squared, the weight of a choice he never asked for pressing down on him. For 20 years he had kept his head low. He tended his cattle, he mended his fences, and he left the world's ugliness to other men. He had earned his solitude. He had paid for his peace. But the sight of Clara's bruised wrists, the raw terror in her eyes, it left no room for retreat. This wasn't the world's ugliness anymore. It was his. It was on his land. His hand reached for the Winchester rifle hanging on pegs above the hearth. It was an old, reliable friend. He took it down, the smooth wood familiar in his grasp. He checked the chamber with a practiced ease learned over decades. The metallic click of the mechanism was loud in the tense silence, ringing like a vow. Clara rose so quickly her chair scraped loudly across the wooden floor. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling but urgent. "He's not coming alone. My stepfather. He owes money to men who don't forgive. They burn farms to ash, and they laugh while the smoke rises." She pointed a shaking finger toward the horizon. Through the window, the riders had drawn close enough to make out their shapes. And the shape they were dragging was clearer now. It was a man, bound at the wrists, stumbling and falling behind the rear horse. Thomas recognized him. It was his closest neighbor, a man named Jedediah, who lived 10 miles east. A quiet man, a family man. They weren't just coming for Clara. They were sending a message to the whole territory. Thomas stepped outside onto the porch, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The men had stopped now just at the edge of his property line. With a casual brutality that made his stomach churn, one of them cut Jedediah loose. The man collapsed in a heap. Then the lead rider drew a pistol. He didn't hesitate. A single shot cracked through the morning air. Jedediah's body jerked once, then lay still. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. This is what happens to anyone who interferes. This is what happens to witnesses. Thomas stepped back inside, his face a grim mask, his jaw set like granite. He turned to Clara. "You ever fired a gun before?" he asked, his voice low and hard. She shook her head, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of horror. "Then today you'll learn," he said. He pressed his old Colt revolver into her hands. It was heavy, awkward in her small grasp, but it was solid. It was real. It was steadier than the fear that shook her from head to toe. "Keep it low. Breathe. And don't flinch." For the first time since the sun had risen, Clara looked at him not with terror, but with a fragile, flickering spark of something else. Hope. It was a dangerous thing, that spark, but it was there. Thomas had made his choice, and in doing so he had given her one too. Stand and fight, or be swept away by the storm. The 3 riders reined in just beyond rifle range, a deliberate, calculated distance. Their horses pawed at the dust, a choreographed show of impatient strength. Thomas stepped out onto his porch, the Winchester held steady in his grip, every line of his body calm but unyielding. He was a mountain, and he would not be moved. Inside the cabin, Clara crouched low by the back window, the heavy Colt clutched in her small hands. Her breath trembled in her chest, but her eyes never left the men outside. The middle rider, a broad-chested man with shoulders as thick as an ox yoke, cupped his hands to his mouth. His voice carried across the open prairie like a rusty blade scraping against stone. "Hayes, we know you've got the girl in there." Thomas's answer came back, low but firm, echoing across the distance. "She isn't yours to claim. You lost that right when you left a man's body on my land." The man laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Jedediah? He saw something he shouldn't have, just like you're doing now. The girl is property, Hayes. Always was, until we say otherwise." His companions smirked, their cold eyes scanning the cabin, measuring the windows, the doors, the angles of attack. They were professionals. Clara's throat tightened. Those words, property, merchandise, collateral. They were the same brands her stepfather had burned into her spirit for years. She pressed her lips together so hard they turned white, fighting to keep from crying out. One of the younger riders nudged his horse forward, his gaze as cold and empty as a winter sky. "Marcus Devlin sends his regards," he said. The name hit Thomas like a hammer blow. Every rancher, every farmer, every shopkeep within 100 miles knew that name. Marcus Devlin. He controlled the territory like a spider at the center of a vast invisible web, half through fear, half through bullets. If Clara was tangled in Devlin's debts, this wasn't some petty squabble over a bad loan. This was a war against a man who believed that human lives were just another form of currency. The rider continued, his words slicing through the morning air. Her stepfather owed a sum, couldn't pay. The girl was pledged as collateral. Then the coward decided she wasn't worth enough. Tried to cheat Devlin by letting the wolves take her. Damaged goods, see? But still Devlin's goods. You understand? Thomas shifted his stance, his finger tight against the trigger. His voice was iron. "I understand that you're talking about a child as if she were a sack of grain. I won't hand her over to men who see her as less than human." The lead gunman leaned forward in his saddle, his face splitting into a grin that held all the patience of a predator. "That's noble talk, Hayes. Real noble. But nobility doesn't keep a roof over your head. Devlin wants what's his. You hand her over, we ride out quiet. No fire, no blood, no trouble for you. You keep your ranch, your herd, even your skin." He gestured with his chin toward the still form of Jedediah, rotting in the sun. "But if you choose wrong, well, you end up like him, and she still comes with us." The prairie wind rose, carrying the stench of death and the crushing weight of the threat. Clara clutched the pistol tighter, the cold metal a stark contrast to her burning fear. Thomas glanced back once, a quick, fleeting look, and his eyes met hers through the dim interior of the cabin. She saw no fear in him, only the steady burning fire of a man who had already decided where he stood. "You've got 1 hour," the rider said, finally pulling his horse around. "Think hard, Hayes. Hand her over and live in peace." He paused, letting the final words sink in. "Refuse, and your land becomes just another lesson in what happens to folks who cross Marcus Devlin." The 3 men turned their mounts, retreating just far enough to wait, confident that the sands of the hourglass were theirs to control. But inside the cabin, Clara whispered, her voice breaking but fierce, "They'll never stop." Thomas set his Winchester down on the table. His jaw was tight and his eyes burned with a grim, terrible resolve. "Then neither will I," he said. The clock had started ticking, but in Thomas's heart, the decision had already been sealed. He would not trade a girl's life for his own comfort. He would not let Marcus Devlin carve another bloody scar across this prairie without resistance. The storm was coming, and he meant to stand tall in it. But he had no idea how deep the storm truly ran. Inside the cabin, the weight of the silence pressed down, heavier than the timbers overhead. Clara sat stiffly at the table, her small hands twisted together, her knuckles white. The sound of the retreating hoofbeats still echoed in the back of her mind, a cruel promise of their return. Thomas set his rifle against the wall and pulled a chair out, sitting opposite her. His weathered face was calm, a mask of control, but his eyes searched hers with a quiet, insistent pressure. "Clara," he said gently, but with an edge of steel, "whatever you know, I need to hear it. All of it." Her lips trembled. Words finally escaped, low and broken. "The man they shot. Jedediah. He was my stepfather's friend. He must have followed him last night. He knew." She choked on a sob. He knew what he was doing. This was a new horror. Her stepfather hadn't just been cruel. He'd been careless. He'd left a witness. And Devlin's men had cleaned up the mess. But that wasn't the secret. Not the real one. She hesitated, tears finally burning at the corners of her eyes, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She took a shuddering breath. "Marcus Devlin. He isn't just the man my stepfather owed money to." She looked up, and the look in her eyes struck Thomas like a physical blow. "He's my real father." The revelation hit him with the force of a thunderclap. Devlin, the most feared, ruthless man in the territory, wasn't just a creditor trying to reclaim collateral. He was blood. That changed everything. It made the threat more personal, more twisted, more insidious. This wasn't business, this was family. Thomas leaned back slowly, the wood of the chair groaning beneath his weight. He exhaled, a long, slow breath through his nose. Clara's voice quickened, a desperate torrent of words, as if she needed to make him understand the true shape of the cage she was in. "My stepfather, Thomas Garrett, he married my Mamah after Devlin cast us out. He wore his kindness like a mask in front of other folks, but behind closed doors." Her throat closed up, and she couldn't finish. She didn't have to. She forced herself to continue. "For years, he hurt me. He told me I was worthless, just like my father said I was. And when Devlin's men came calling about the debt Garrett owed, he panicked. He knew if Devlin found out what he'd done to me, he'd be killed. Not for being cruel, for damaging property." Thomas's fists clenched on the table, the veins standing out like cords against his scarred skin. He had suspected the cruelty. He'd seen its shadow in her bruises, in the way she flinched at every sudden movement. But hearing it confirmed, hearing the cold, transactional logic behind it, stoked a fire in his chest he thought had long since burned out. "So he tied you to my fence," Thomas muttered, his voice hardening into something sharp and dangerous. Clara nodded, misery etched on her face. "He said the wolves would finish what he started. Then he could tell Devlin I'd run off and died in the wilderness. The debt would be wiped away, and no one would ever know." Her words came out in ragged shudders, as if speaking them aloud was stripping away the last defense she had left. For a long, heavy moment, Thomas said nothing. He simply stared at the patterns in the wooden table, his jaw working, a storm of memories colliding with the present. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and raw with a pain that was decades old. "You're not the only one who's been sold like stock." Clara blinked at him, startled out of her own grief. Thomas leaned forward, resting his powerful forearms on the table. His gray eyes no longer held just sympathy. They carried the crushing weight of a confession. "When I was 15, my own father lost too much in a card game. He didn't have the money, so he handed me over to a man named Crawford as payment for the debt." He pulled in a slow, ragged breath. For the first time, Clara noticed the faint stiffness in his movements, the way he never quite leaned back fully in his chair, as if something in his spine was fused together. 2 years, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. 2 years I spent under that man's whip. 2 years of labor and chains and hunger, until I finally broke free and ran. Clara's mouth parted. Her own fear was momentarily eclipsed by a sudden, shocking wave of recognition. "That's why," she whispered. "That's why you knew. Why you didn't look at me like I was ruined." Thomas gave a single sharp nod. "Because I've seen it. I've lived it. and I swore to myself no one would ever own me again. That's why I came out here. That's why I've stayed alone all these years." The fire popped in the hearth, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. His gaze didn't waver from hers. "But seeing you here, Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 20 years. "Hearing what they've done, it's reminded me of something I tried to bury deep. You don't heal by running away. You heal by standing your ground. And I've been running long enough." Clara's breath caught in her throat. For the first time since she'd woken up on that cold, terrifying morning, she saw in him not just a rescuer, but an ally, a brother carved from the same suffering, carrying the same invisible scars. "You don't have to fight for me," she whispered, though the words lacked conviction even to her own ears. Thomas reached across the table, his big, calloused hand stopping just short of hers, respecting the space she guarded so fiercely. "No, Clara," he said, and his voice was the steadiest thing she had ever heard. "I'm not fighting for you. I'm fighting because of you, because if I hand you back to them, then everything I endured, everything I swore I'd never allow to happen again, it all means nothing." Outside, the prairie lay silent, the hourglass of their enemies slowly draining away. But inside the four walls of that small cabin, something shifted. The lonely rancher who had sworn off the world made his choice, not with grand declarations or heroic speeches, but with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man reclaiming his own soul. He rose from the table, checked the Winchester by the door, and said with steady resolve, "I won't run. Not this time." Clara's eyes, shimmering with both fear and a fragile newborn hope, finally nodded. The storm was closing in, but in Thomas Hayes, she saw the one thing her life had always lacked, someone willing to stand unflinching between her and the darkness. But the darkness was bigger than either of them knew, because just then, on the distant ridge, a second dust cloud began to swell. It was larger, heavier, and moving with a terrifying military precision. This was no small party of thugs. This was the man himself. The prairie trembled with the thunder of hooves. The second dust cloud swelled, a roiling, angry thing against the pale sky. Thomas's gut clenched. This was no posse. This was an army. 6 more riders cut across the open ground, their silhouettes stark and menacing. At their center rode a man who carried himself like a king surveying his dominion. Marcus Devlin. He was older than Thomas had expected. Silver streaked the black hair at his temples, and lines were etched deep into his face like cracks in dry earth. But his posture was ramrod straight, and his eyes, even from a distance, were sharp and pale as ice. He wore fine clothes, a tailored coat, and clean boots, ill-suited to the Wyoming frontier. It was a statement. He was above the dust he rode through. At his flanks trailed hardened gunmen, men whose reputations were built on blood and fear. The balance had shifted catastrophically. What had been 3 against 1 was now 9 against 1, and every single rifle barrel was pointed toward Thomas's land. Devlin slowed his horse to a walk, a measured, deliberate pull on the reins. He let the animal step delicately around the body of Jedediah. He surveyed the scene, the small cabin, the man on the porch, the waiting thugs, with a quiet, chilling calculation. Then he spoke, his voice smooth but cold as a river stone. "Well, well, what have we here?" The lead rider, the one who had given Thomas the ultimatum, scrambled to explain. "Mr. Devlin, sir, this rancher, Hayes, he's got the girl. He won't give her up." Devlin silenced him with a flick of his gloved hand, not even gracing him with a glance. His pale gaze was locked on Thomas, steady and unnerving. "I understand," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance, "that you've taken possession of something that belongs to me." Thomas gripped the Winchester tighter, forcing a calm he didn't feel into his own voice. "Nothing here belongs to you. Clara is not property. At the sound of her name, Devlin's expression shifted. He straightened in the saddle, and his gaze narrowed with a disturbing, unsettling familiarity. Clara, he repeated, tasting the syllables as if they were a claim he was staking. Is that what she calls herself now? 16 years I've let her live under false names with a fool for a guardian. But make no mistake, she is mine, by blood and by right. The possessive chill in his tone made Clara, hidden at the back window, recoil as if struck. It wasn't the sound of a father's longing. It was the sound of ownership, sharp and absolute, as if she were a prize horse branded with his mark. Thomas Hayes lifted his chin, his defiance unwavering. She's not your collateral, not your debt, and not yours to command. For a moment, a heavy silence stretched across the prairie, thick with the weight of violence yet to come. Then Garrett's stepfather, the one who'd brought her here, still among the first 3 riders, blurted out, desperate to save his own skin. "She ain't worth the trouble, Mr. Devlin. I was doing you a favor, leaving her for the wolves." The shot came so fast it startled even Devlin's own seasoned gunmen. Devlin's revolver seemed to leap into his hand. It barked once, the sharp crack shattering the stillness. Garrett screamed, a high, thin sound, and toppled from his horse, clutching a sudden bloom of red on his shoulder. Devlin holstered the gun with the same casual grace another man might tip his hat. His voice, calm as ever, carried across the prairie. "Nobody asked you to think, Garrett." It wasn't mercy that he'd only wounded him. It wasn't even punishment for his betrayal. It was a demonstration. A cold, calculated lesson for every soul present that Marcus Devlin, and Marcus Devlin alone, decided what had value. He decided who lived and who died. Shooting Garrett wasn't about Clara's suffering or Garrett's disloyalty. It was about absolute, unquestionable control. From inside the cabin, Clara's breath hitched. Her hand trembled against the pistol grip. Thomas Hayes, however, didn't flinch. He read the message in Devlin's action as clearly as if it were written in the sky. This was not a negotiation. It was a king staking his claim. And in that moment he knew the real battle hadn't even begun. Then something impossible happened. The cabin window behind him shattered with a sharp crack, shards of glass scattering across the kitchen floor. Clara threw herself through the frame. Her skirt snagged on the splintered sill, but desperation lent her a furious strength. She tore free, hitting the ground hard, rolling and scrambling to her feet, the Colt revolver clutched in her hand. The sudden noise, the shocking act of defiance, drew every eye. And in that single heartbeat of distraction, the prairie erupted. Gunfire split the still air. Thomas fired first, his Winchester bucking hard against his shoulder. One of Devlin's riders pitched sideways out of his saddle with a grunt. Another fell with a choked cry as lead ripped through the dust at his horse's feet. Horses screamed and reared, wheeling in panic as bullets flew wild across the yard. Thomas rolled off the porch, diving for the meager cover of the water trough as wood splinters from the porch posts rained down around him. "Enough!" Devlin's roar cut through the chaos like a whip crack. His hands shot into the air, a command for silence that was instantly obeyed. "I want her alive, you fools! Hold your fire!" The shooting stuttered into an uneasy, smoky quiet. The only sounds were the moans of the wounded man and the ragged, panicked breathing of frightened horses. Smoke drifted across the field, curling in the wind like pale ghosts. Inside his chest, Thomas's heart hammered like a war drum, but his grip on the Winchester never faltered. 2 men down, but there were still 7 left standing. And now Clara was out there, somewhere beyond the cabin, facing a danger she could scarcely imagine. Devlin twisted in his saddle, his pale eyes scanning the terrain, a predator hunting his prey. "Find her," he snarled. "Bring her back to me." 3 riders spurred their horses around the side of the cabin, their hooves tearing divots in the earth as they disappeared from sight. The silence that followed was broken only by the thud of Thomas's boots as he shifted his position, moving to the far side of the trough. He adjusted his sight lines, risking a quick glance toward the rocky ridge that rose up behind his ranch, his mind calculating, planning. Minutes dragged by, each one an eternity. Then came the shout, "Boss, she's up in the rocks!" The rider's voice carried a note of urgency and something else, surprise. "She's armed, and she knows how to use it." A crack of relief shot through Thomas's tension for the briefest of instants. The outcropping behind his ranch. He knew it well. It was solid stone, a high vantage point, with clear sight lines in every direction. He had taught himself to shoot up there 2 decades ago, carving skill and patience out of solitude. Clara had chosen wisely. Whether by raw instinct or a memory of his guidance, she had found the one defensible position on his land. "Stubborn girl," Devlin muttered, his jaw tightening. Thomas could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, something that looked unnervingly like pride. Just like her mother. While Devlin's focus shifted toward the ridge, Thomas seized his chance. He slid out from behind the trough, keeping low to the ground, his boots silent on the packed dirt. In a swift, desperate movement, he darted across the open space. Bullets tore the air where he had been a second before, but they missed their mark. He slammed hard against the solid corner of his cabin, his breath ragged, his rifle ready. For the first time since the riders arrived, he wasn't a stationary target pinned on his own porch. He had angles now. He had shadows. And he had the will to fight on Clara's terms. The prairie, which had once felt suffocating in its silence, now seemed to breathe with him, a living, breathing battlefield, as he prepared for the next wave of the storm. The standoff stretched into a dangerous, buzzing silence. Horses snorted and stamped the dirt, their riders shifting uneasily in their saddles, their eyes flicking between the man at the cabin and the girl in the rocks. Clara's shadow still flickered on the ridge, a small, defiant figure with a rifle raised. Devlin's patience, never a deep well to begin with, had worn thin. His pale eyes narrowed, and the corners of his mouth curled into a cruel, dismissive sneer. "You think hiding her up there changes anything, Hayes?" Devlin called out, his voice ringing across the yard. "She's mine by blood, and I'll not be made a fool of. Not again." He spurred his horse a few steps forward, his voice rising with fury. "Do you hear me? I won't lose face in this valley twice." His words cracked like a whip, thick with the wounded pride of a man who thrived on being feared. Thomas's jaw tightened, his rifle held steady against the corner of the cabin. "She's not yours, Devlin. Not by law, not by any right. She's free now." Devlin barked a laugh, a sharp, humorless sound that was more of a weapon than an expression of mirth. "Free?" He spat the word onto the dirt. "I decide what's free, and if she won't walk out of those rocks, then I'll smoke her out." With a deliberate, theatrical menace, he reached into his saddlebag. He drew out a bundle of dynamite sticks, lashed tight with black twine. A collective gasp rippled through his own men. This was an escalation beyond bullets, beyond reason. This was pure annihilation. Devlin ignored them. He struck a match on his saddle horn and let the small flame dance inches from the fuse, his eyes fixed on the ridge. 1, he began to count, his voice calm and even. 2. His gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on the cabin and the rocks alike. "When I reach 10, you'll be digging splinters of her bones out of that hillside." From her perch, Clara's eyes widened in horror. Even at this distance, Thomas could see her hands trembling. He had to do something. Not with a bullet. With words. He raised his voice, shouting loud enough to pierce the terrible moment. "You call yourself a man, Devlin? Let everyone here hear it. You didn't just abandon your own daughter. You sold her. You turned her over like cattle for a debt that wasn't even hers. Devlin's count faltered. 3. You let your man beat her until she bled, Thomas roared, the truth a weapon sharper than any knife. You let him leave her for the wolves to finish when she didn't beg the way you liked. That's not a father. That's a coward hiding behind his power and his money. The words cut through the dusk like a blade. Murmurs stirred among Devlin's riders. They were killers, yes, but even they had lines. They looked at each other, their faces uncertain, uneasy. For the first time all day, Devlin's absolute authority had a crack in it. His hand faltered, the match trembling as doubt crept across the faces of his men. "Shut your mouth!" Devlin roared, his pride wounded far deeper than any bullet could have reached. He flung the match aside in a fit of rage, sparks spitting as fury consumed him. But the hesitation was all Thomas needed. A fraction of a second, a break in the rhythm. He surged from his cover, his boots pounding the hard-packed dirt. He closed the gap in a handful of heartbeats, slamming into Devlin's arm with the force of a battering ram just as the discarded match found the dynamite's fuse. It hissed to life. The bundle of dynamite tumbled from Devlin's grasp, rolling wildly across the ground. Shouts erupted. Horses reared in terror as men scattered, diving from their saddles. With every muscle in his body straining, Thomas shoved the hissing bundle with the butt of his Winchester, sending it skidding across the yard, away from the cabin, away from the horses, out into the empty open field. Seconds later, the world split apart. The explosion tore through the prairie with a thunderous crack. Soil and smoke and rock billowed skyward in a black cloud. Horses bolted, men threw themselves flat on the ground, and the very earth shook beneath their boots. But the cabin still stood. The ridge still held Clara, safe and sound, and the 2 people who had been marked for slaughter still drew breath. When the smoke began to clear, Thomas rose slowly, his chest heaving, his rifle ready. Across the chaos, Clara's eyes found his, wide with both terror and a profound, bone-deep relief. Devlin staggered to his feet, his fine coat torn, his face twisted in a mask of rage and disbelief. The roar of the blast still echoed in his ears. Thomas squared his shoulders. Dust streaked his face, but a resolve as hard as iron burned steady in his eyes. The message was clear. He would fight to the last breath, not just to protect Clara's life, but to rip away the chains of her past, one link at a time. And for the first time it was Marcus Devlin, not Thomas Hayes, who looked uncertain. The dust from the dynamite blast still lingered in the air, tasting of sulfur and scorched earth, when Devlin pulled himself upright. Fury was etched across every line of his face. His men shifted uneasily, a pack of wolves suddenly unsure of their alpha. None dared to move until he lifted a gloved hand, calling for order. The silence that followed felt like judgment itself. It was thick, cold, and final. His pale eyes cut toward Thomas Garrett, Clara's stepfather, who was still writhing on the ground from the earlier gunshot wound to his shoulder. Blood soaked his sleeve, but a defiant sneer remained on his lips. To Devlin, Garrett was no longer an asset or even an enemy. He was a liability, a loose end. "You were trusted," Devlin hissed, his voice low and venomous as he drew his pistol again. "Trusted to manage what was mine. Instead, you turned sloppy. You tied her wrong. You left her where a common rancher could stumble across her. You let shame touch my name." Garrett tried to push himself up on one elbow, spitting dirt and blood. "She was nothing but a—" The gunshot split his words in half. Garrett collapsed, still and silent, the dust swallowing the last twitch of his miserable life. A murmur rippled through the riders, half approval for the show of strength, half raw unease at the coldness of the act. But Devlin didn't blink. To him, the execution was not justice. It was simply maintenance, like cutting rot out of a tree before it can spread. Clara gasped from her place on the ridge. Even after all the torment Garrett had put her through, the sight of him being executed so coldly, so casually, left her trembling. Devlin looked up at her, his voice suddenly sharp, but dripping with a false, poisonous tenderness. "I am sorry, Clara," he called out, though the words rang hollow as a drum. "Sorry you had to see that. But you must understand, I correct my mistakes, even the ones made by those who mishandle what belongs to me." His tone wasn't one of sorrow, it was one of ownership, of possession dressed up in the language of apology. Thomas, standing below with his rifle at the ready, barked back, "She doesn't belong to anyone, least of all you." Devlin's gaze cut to him hard and assessing. For a long moment, Thomas thought another bullet might fly his way. But instead, Devlin's expression changed. A strange, calculating look entered his eyes. He reached inside his fine coat and drew out a thick, heavy roll of bills, bound tight with twine. He weighed it in his palm, a smirk tugging at his lips, as if he were mocking the very concept of choice, of morality, of anything that couldn't be bought and sold. "Rancher," Devlin said evenly, tossing the bundle into the dirt between them. It landed with a soft, obscene thud. "Take it. It's more money than you'll see in 3 winters. Enough to buy a new ranch, a new herd, a new life anywhere west of the Divide. All I ask," he said, his voice dropping, "is that you take her. Take her far away from here. Let her vanish into the horizon so I needn't ever hear her name whispered in this valley again." The offer slithered into the air like a snake, coiling around every person who heard it. Some of Devlin's men nodded as if it were a generous act. Others frowned at its inherent cruelty. For Clara, it felt like new chains being forged right before her eyes. Her life was being reduced, once again, to a simple transaction, a ledger line to be bought and erased. She shook her head slowly, her voice breaking as she shouted down from the rocks, "You can't buy my freedom with your blood-stained money." Thomas glanced at the bundle lying in the dirt, then his eyes went up to meet Clara's. His hand did not move. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. Devlin, however, mistook it for consideration. He gave a curt, satisfied nod and turned his horse. "Good," he muttered, signaling to his men. "Make sure she's gone. That's all I require." With that, he pulled his riders into formation. Hooves thundered as the troop wheeled away, the sound fading toward the horizon. Dust curled in their wake, trailing behind them like smoke from a fire not yet quenched. They left behind the corpse of Garrett, the untouched bundle of bills lying in the dirt, and the lingering heavy weight of a decision that had not yet been spoken, but was already carved deep into Thomas's resolve. Clara carefully made her way down from the ridge, her eyes locking on him, filled with equal parts fear and a desperate, fragile hope. In the ringing silence, the unspoken question burned between them. Would he take the money and send her away, vanishing as his own father had vanished from his life? Or would he stand beside her, even if it meant defying the long, dark shadow of Marcus Devlin forever? The answer, she knew, would not come in words. It would come in the path Thomas chose to walk next. The sun was sinking low, painting the horizon in streaks of golden crimson, when the shallow grave was finally filled. There was no headstone, no marker, just a small mound of earth where Thomas Garrett's shadowed, twisted legacy had finally come to an end. Clara stood silently, her arms wrapped tight around herself, not in grief for the man who had tormented her, but in a profound, soul-deep relief that his hold on her was finally, irrevocably broken. Thomas placed his dusty hat over his chest for a moment. He offered no prayer, only a quiet moment of respect for the land that now claimed another dark secret. Then he turned to Clara. Their small wagon was packed with what few supplies they could carry. He had left the money where it lay in the dirt, a monument to a man's soullessness. Colorado's ahead, he said softly, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the open road that stretched out before them. For the first time in her life, the word future did not taste like fear. Side by side, the man who had run from his past and the girl who had been chained to hers, they set out. They left behind the dust and blood of Wyoming, carrying with them nothing more than the fragile, precious promise of a new beginning. They had faced down the monster, and they had won. Not with bullets, but with something far more powerful: the refusal to be broken. If you enjoyed this story and want to see what happens to Thomas and Clara on the road to Colorado, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You never know what darkness is waiting just over the next ridge.